Hello and welcome to another episode of the Halftime Podcast. I'm your host, Danny Cook, and today we are joined by a very special guest. Something a little bit different to our previous coaching podcast episodes, and hopefully he could bring a different insight and a different avenue of thinking to this podcast. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ollie Cottis. How are you, Ollie?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be on.
Not a problem. So how are you keeping yourself busy at this time?
So I'm quite lucky because I've got all my family back at home. So I've got my brother. So we basically we play a lot of table tennis during the day, try and do a bit of sports psychology stuff, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And just generally trying to do the standard exercise that's been allowed. So you get out of the house, get doing stuff, and try and make the days a little bit varied, I think, so it's not just the same thing every day.
Nice. And how's the table tennis going? Is it very competitive?
It's always very competitive. Someone always ends up in a bad mood after we finish playing, but we've got a long tournament going on throughout the whole of lockdown, so it's pretty tight at the minute. So
we'll have to get Sky Sports on the case. So they've got some sports to broadcast then.
Get the cameras in.
Are you utilising any of your psychology skills when it comes to table tennis?
Well, to be honest with you, we're psyching each other out all the time when we're out there. So it's I get done by all the stuff that I try and tell people not to get caught up by and things like that. So it works both ways, but always try and throw a few mind games in there. Yeah.
Love it. So without further ado, let's jump into the main topic of discussion. So for those who obviously haven't come across you before, haven't heard from you before, would you mind just explaining your role and what's involved in being a sports psychologist?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am currently training as a sports psychologist, and through that training it involves getting some hands-on experience at sports clubs. So I'm primarily focusing on football at the minute, and they're the two experiences or practices that I've got so far. So one's at Ginja FC Football Club with the men's teams and the under-17s, and then the other is with the first team at Brentford Women's Football Club. So get to work in both men's and women's football, which is really good. And for me, the role basically covers two main areas, which are performance enhancement and then also enhancing well-being. And I think both areas are as important as each other, or should be as important as each other for football clubs, potentially with enhancing well-being as taking a priority. If that was to drop off, then my belief is that would then need to be built up before going into any of the performance enhancement stuff, because you need that foundation of a healthy mind and healthy well-being and being in a good space in order to maximize your potential and your performance. So it covers those two aspects. And I guess the best way to describe how I go about things, because the brilliant thing about psychology is that everyone can go about it in a slightly different way. So any psychologist may take a slightly different approach to what I take and things like that. So, and the best way I can describe it is if you picture a triangle, and on each point of the triangle, you've got thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And it's basically about how those three things interact with each other. So trying to optimize that triangle almost to gain the best outcomes for you personally. So try and get positive emotions that lead to positive thoughts, that lead to positive behaviors, etc. And that's how I tend to operate when I'm working with these clubs, is to try and optimize these thoughts and these emotions so that we can generate the best performance behaviors and also well-being behaviors for whoever it is that I'm working with.
That's great. So just building on from that then, is there any particular area that you feel is probably your strongest when it comes to sports psychology? Is there a real area that you think you sort of take it to your own and that's just your area of expertise?
So I think it's a great question. It's something that obviously only really doing a a season, or didn't even complete the season, really, did we? Unfortunately, of
Unfortunately not.
the applied work. It's been quite varied so far, so I haven't really been able to get too heavy into one particular area, because obviously, as I said, every individual is different, so people come to you wanting to improve different things or to solve a particular problem. I think I've had a lot of experience in terms of building confidence and building players' confidence, and if they lose that confidence, and trying to find ways to build that up. So that's probably something that I've had more experience with dealing with, and trying to generate a couple of techniques in order to improve that. But as for a specific specialized area, I think for me that's almost too early to say, because of the length of time that I've been doing what I've been doing.
Okay, yeah, that's a fair response. So let's rewind the clock. Let's take it all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah.
How did you first come across a sports psychologist path?
Yeah, so I think it's one of those, it's not an obvious route to take, and it certainly wasn't something that I couldn't sit here and say it's something I've wanted to do since I was 4 years old or anything like that. It's definitely developed as I've gone through the educational scales, really, or the educational route. So I did sports studies, GCSE and A levels, and loved it. And that then led me on to doing a degree in sport and exercise science. And within that, they did a lot of sports psychology modules. So one that particularly stood out for me was a module on motivational psychology. So that was really influential for me in the third year of my degree. And then I think, weirdly, or not weirdly, but the World Cup in 2018, that was in my final year of uni. So all the courses had finished, and we got into that brilliant summer of the World Cup. And there was a lot of talk around that World Cup, especially with the England team, about how they used a sports psychologist and how they were very open about using it. And I think that really, it wasn't until that point that it really opened my eyes to it. And I really started to think about, oh, that would be a really interesting thing to do. And that's when I got into looking to do a sports psychology master's, which I was lucky enough, there was a place left on the course at St Mary's, and I managed to get in straight away in the September after my degree. So I got to carry it straight on, which was brilliant. And so then did that, obviously the master's for a year, did it full time. And that gets me to stage 1 of being a sports psychologist. And then I'm looking to start my stage 2 in October. Hopefully get that process up and running, so that I can get fully qualified. As I said, at the minute, just training. And then obviously the roles with Ginja and Brentford have come by just sending emails around and asking around if anyone wants to utilize a sports psychologist voluntarily. So, and that's been really, really helpful for me to have that experience. So that's been fantastic.
Great. We're going to touch on those two very shortly, but I just want to delve a little bit deeper into your association with football.
Yeah.
Did you always have did you have any other role as a youngster? Was you a player? Was you a coach? Did you have any other role in the game as you progressed, obviously on the psychology side, or is this new? Or is this latest sort of entry point where you are now a psychologist for 2 teams? Is that your first entry into the footballing world?
No. So I played football when I was younger, never to a particularly good standard, but I always used to love it, and I loved being part of a team. And I think wanting to be involved in sport as a career has all stemmed from that, just the love of that feeling of being part of a team, and I just loved it as I was growing up. And then I think I did get into coaching a lot whilst I was doing my degree, and I got my level 1 coaching in my final year of uni, actually. So I was looking towards a coaching path. And then, as I said, with the World Cup, and that brought that into fruition, I thought to myself, actually, the psychological aspect of coaching would be something that would be really good to explore, because I think that's really important. I think a coach nowadays needs to have that sort of aspect in their locker. It's not just all about tactics and styles of play and things like that. It's also about understanding your players as people, as well as as well as performers, if that makes sense. So I thought of doing the psychology route to build into my coaching would be a really good way to progress my coaching career, so to speak. But then once I was doing my sports psychology degree, I just found it so interesting, really liked all the topics that I was doing, that I just decided that I would focus solely on the psychology side of it and put my coaching to one side, and hence why I haven't got any badges since then, and focus solely on the psychology aspect of it. But yes, certainly the psychology stems from a point of coaching and how it can be really helpful for coaches and for coaches to use.
Interesting. So I guess now, and correct me if I'm wrong, do you think back to the course and when you was, let's say, the level 1 course, the degree program, do you look back at some of that stuff now and go, okay, now I see why they did this, or or in reality they should have done this, because actually a player would be psychologically better off by this happening and this happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you've looked at it, luckily for me, I've looked at it almost from both angles, the coaching and the sports psychology perspective. And so now it's definitely helped me in terms of being able to link those two together, in terms of how I can talk to coaches and help them in any way that I can. And also from the other side of having been a coach very briefly, you can see it from the player's perspective. How can the player see the coaching styles the best way, so that, if that makes sense, so that you can get a full circle of that sort of cyclical relationship between coach and player, so that everyone's understanding the importance of the psychological aspects of the game that can be introduced into training.
Yep. So talking about those two teams that you now work with, obviously Ginja and Brentford ladies, talk us through which one came first and how you delve in a little bit more to the experience and how you're finding things there.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, because of confidentiality and things like that, I won't be naming.
Yeah. Don't name names.
But yeah, so Ginja came first, and then luckily there was a link between Ginja and Brentford ladies, so I got a foot in that door, and both were thankfully really keen to get a sports psychologist in their club, because they hadn't had one before. So I was very lucky in that sense. So that was brilliant for me. So Ginja came first, and then Brentford after that, and it's been two experiences that have been very, very different in terms of the things that I've had to do. And like I said, sports psychology is such an individual thing that even in the same situation, you'll get 2 or 3 different people interpreting it a different way. So that's what makes it so interesting. That's what makes it such an exciting field to be in. And I just think that, yeah, both opportunities have given me the opportunity to really practice a wide-ranging set of skills, which has been fantastic. So I think, like I said, building confidence, done a few team meetings on mindset and the right mindset to have for progression, helping people return from injuries, things like that. So yeah, lots of different skills that I've been able to test out within the two experiences, which have been fantastic.
How have you found that contrast? Because obviously, as you've alluded to, you've got Ginja, which is a grassroots club, and then you've got Brentford, which is obviously a club that are moving up the ranks in terms of the women's game. So how did you find the contrast?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not so much a contrast in terms of setup or how it's run, in the sense of I still just go down to training sessions and then on match days at the weekends, and it's still, I think with Ginja, you've got 2 sessions a week. With the ladies, I just go to the one. So in terms of the setup and what I'm able to do, it's pretty much the same, because it's been quite a challenge. I found it quite a challenge for me in that time frame to get a lot done, because obviously it's not a specific time set aside for sports psychology. So a lot of the time is spent just wandering around, watching, seeing if anyone wants to chat. But not a lot of time just set aside for pure sports psychology stuff, which obviously I completely understand. Everyone's got to train. At that level, clubs don't have the luxury or the money to buy out pitches for longer lengths of time just to put half an hour of psychology on the end of their sessions and things like that. But I just think that it all depends. A lot of things have been similar, but like I said, the individual working with individuals is just completely different, and that's the best way I can explain it. You're never going to get two clubs, even if they're at the same level. It's never going to be the same experience because everyone interprets things in their own way, and there has to be no judgment, no comparison between the two, because people that's just how people interpret certain situations.
Is there any difference in terms of access to players compared to obviously Ginja and Brentford?
Is there? No, I wouldn't say there is. Like I said, because the amount of time I spend at training is the same. I only get that allotted slot, and then match days. So I'd say the amount of time you get with the men and the ladies is about the same, to be honest.
Okay. So obviously at the moment, with trainings off across the board for pretty much everyone in terms of the football side of things, are you being asked to do any kind of psychology stuff from afar at Brentford or at Ginja at the moment?
So at Ginja we're trying to run some virtual sessions on a Friday night when the guys would usually train. So we've got trying to do some tactical analysis with them, which comes from the coach's side, and then I'm doing maybe 10-minute stints on the end of those sessions, just looking at various psychological skills. And just basically it's different to how I would usually like to operate, because I like it to be more interactive, so you can get feedback from the people you're working with and stuff like that. But it's good for them to get some sort of regular contact with football. So trying to do those virtual sessions on a Friday night, which I've done one so far and think it went really well. So that will come next week, which is brilliant. And then it's just really already looking forward to pre-season and next season, and nothing really for next season has been put in place yet because it's still slightly too early, but coaches are working on fitness. I'm sure that's for most clubs around the country, trying to build up fitness in this time off, because that's basically all we can do when you can't get training and you can't get to see the athletes and stuff. But yeah, I think when the time comes and when pre-season comes into it, start to look at things like team values and set goals for the season, and just lay the foundations to try and have a really successful season.
Yeah, and obviously you did, as you've alluded to, the presentation on Friday for Ginja. I was there as well. If you had to give a message to any of the players that you're working with, whether that be Ginja or Brentford, during this time, what would it be?
It would be, I think, to try and keep things varied. Don't get stuck in a rut. Try and do something a little bit different every day, especially if, as lots of people have, if there's no school and you're not working, then you're basically just in your house with one bit of exercise to do a day. So that can get quite boring, quite repetitive. So to try and do something varied each day, set yourself little challenges to do each day, just to keep motivation high, to keep spirits high. That's what I would recommend to do.
Great words of wisdom there. So just looking at your role as a whole, I just want to find out from you what you would consider maybe your best bit, or maybe the best bits about being a sports psychologist. What's the most rewarding thing or things for you as part of your role?
Yeah, so I think for me personally, it's working with those individuals or a team and being able to see the progression. So if you're working on something like confidence, being able to, after you've worked with someone, being able to visibly see that they're a happier, more confident person when they're on the pitch or when they're off the pitch is particularly rewarding. So it's for me, it's all about that, being able to work with someone and then help them progress and help them become better, or fix a little problem that they might have perceived that they had, or anything like that. And that's a real sense of achievement and satisfaction to be able to help someone like that and just to see it happening in front of you.
Yeah, I can imagine that must be so satisfying to see. Okay, looking at the flip side now. Again, with obviously you don't want to delve into any individual cases or anything like that. So just if you can just sort of briefly overview maybe an aspect that you don't enjoy as much as any other about being a sports psychologist.
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. What don't I enjoy? Um, like I say, I haven't been doing it for too long, and largely it has been really positive experiences. Of course, when you try something with an individual and it doesn't work, that's not a great feeling. But I think at my stage, that's something that probably needs to happen, because I have to learn from those sorts of things and figure out how I could do it a little bit better next time, or reflect on those sorts of things. I think one thing I don't enjoy, or what frustrates me at doing it at this sort of level, is probably the time that's available, because obviously if you looked at an elite level, the players, coaches are in every day, you get a lot more contact, you'd maybe feel like you could do a lot more. And obviously, no fault to the clubs that I'm working with, that sort of time isn't available. So I think at the moment that is probably the worst thing, or the most frustrating thing about being a sports psychologist, is almost the fact that I can't do enough of it, if that makes sense, without it being too cheesy, because of the time available to me to go into training and matches and things like that. Doesn't give me too much time to have that major impact or work with a player really long term.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. And obviously, I get to see it firsthand when you are down, and the positive impact you have on obviously both the men's team and the under-17s team. So yeah, I can 100% agree. You mentioned about I guess the contact time with the coaches as well.
Yeah.
I want to delve a little bit deeper. How crucial is that relationship with a coach for a sports psychologist?
I mean, I think it's fundamental, if I'm honest. I mean, I've been very lucky with the two clubs that I've gone into. All the coaches very welcoming, very open to introducing these techniques, and also use these techniques already in their coaching sessions, which is fantastic. So I've got very lucky in that sense. But I think without that openness, without that willingness to incorporate psychology into their coaching, it would be extremely hard for it to be effective, because you need to be, in my opinion, you need to have coaching staff that are all working together and pulling in the same direction. So if you've got coaches who aren't open to the idea of using psychology, then that job as a psychologist becomes almost impossible, because their training sessions won't incorporate using those techniques. They won't be trying to develop the players mentally. And then that just becomes a very difficult job to do. But as I say, that's all speculation, because I haven't experienced that, because the coaches that I've worked with have been really good and really open to using sports psychology.
No, 100%. It's your experience, and yeah, I'm sure certainly for you, and I think you're probably right there anyway in terms of that relationship. Just thinking all the way back to those initial sessions where you came down to Ginja or you went down to Brentford,
Yeah.
um, how did those feel for you coming in? Obviously, with a bunch of players you've never met before, a bunch of coaches you've never met before, and yeah, how did those feel for you?
Well, I was nervous, I can tell you that, but it was no, it was good. I think they were probably the hardest times because, like you say, you don't know the players, don't know the coaches, so you've just got to throw yourself in and try and get to know them as quickly as possible. And developing those sorts of relationships, there needs to be an element of trust there, and trust takes a while to develop, which is completely understandable. So those first few weeks, months are the difficult bits where you're trying to develop that rapport with the coaches, with the players, so that they feel that they can come and talk to you about things like that. And for some players, it takes a lot longer to develop that. For some, it will take a little bit less time. So I think those early few weeks are, well, you'll know, for the first few weeks, I didn't do too much. I just wandered around, had little chats with some of the guys, just made myself known basically. And then only after being there for a few weeks did I properly try to get involved and really delve into the job that I was supposed to be doing, because it takes time to develop those sorts of relationships.
Now, I know this is going to be like a can of worms, this one opening, but purely because there's just so much, I'm sure. But when you're watching these sessions, what are you specifically looking out for?
So I mean, like you say, there's so many things. You look to my notebook, it's got all sorts of scribbles in it that you end up scribbling out at the end of the night because it wasn't even important. But you're looking at things like how players interact with each other, how they respond to making mistakes, how they respond to doing something right. You're looking at whether they get distracted on the pitch. You're trying to look at as much as you can, really, but I think it's important. It's easy to get into a rhythm where you look for things that are wrong, and that's absolutely not the case. So I don't like to look at it in the way I work as it being problem focused. I like to think of it as you're looking for how you can help rather than how you can fix anything. And so I'm not just standing there trying to pick faults in people so that I can improve them. It's just simply about trying to observe, trying to just objectively trying to look at what people are doing and recording that down, so that when you speak to a player, you have a basic understanding of what they do, how they react to things, whether that be a good or a bad thing. Generating that basic understanding of how a person operates gives you a lot better chance to work effectively with them, I think.
And I guess as well that the same thing applies for coaches when you're working with coaches.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think you need to understand your players, but also as people, in order for that relationship to be fully functioning. I think that's a really crucial thing for, especially in the modern game, to understand them as people first, almost, and that other things go on in people's lives that aren't just football, and understanding all that is crucial to that relationship for a coach and a player.
Now, I know with the Ginja men's team, you have obviously you've been to a lot more games, and you've been able to listen into some of the team talks, and I know you've worked with Harry, and you're feeding back ideas with him in terms of team talks.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, and again, this is probably a very open-ended question, but for you, what does a perfect team talk look like? What does it need to include?
What does it need to include? So I think, I mean, some of my answers must sound like such a cop out, but it does depend on the situation, the type of game. All those things will affect what needs to be said. For me, it should always be clear. It should always be motivating, and basically just very concisely ironing out what it is that you want from your players. I think by the time they get to a match day or they get to half time, they know how to play. So it's about reminding them of to do the things that they want them to do, if that makes sense. So if you want them to play out from the back, then make sure they follow those basic principles. And I think as a coach, if they do what you're asking them to do, then you don't really have too much cause to be annoyed with them or to get frustrated with them. And so a team talk should outline those basic principles, really, so that there's a good understanding between player and coach. But like I say, it could be different situation would require different things, but that generically, I think that would be a decent starting point.
Great. So slightly out there question, this one. But obviously, you know the world we live in terms of technological advancements. So I wondered if, I know obviously you're quite fresh to working within a team environment and sports psychology, but has technology had any effect on that at all?
On psychology?
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely it would have done. I mean, I think if you think of key games where technology has played a big impact, I mean, I'm a Spurs fan, so quite a few come to mind, particularly against Man City. But those sorts of things, I think technology requires there to be an increased resilience within your team, because you can go from that euphoria of thinking you've scored a goal to that suddenly being taken away from you, and being able to deal with that sort of sudden setback requires a great deal of resilience, and some teams will do it better than others. And I think it's here to stay. So it's definitely something to responding to those sorts of moments of adversity will become quite crucial for teams going forward, because obviously the Spurs case is probably a poor one because it happened so late in the game, so there's not a lot of time to do anything. But for example, Sheffield United played Spurs in the league, and they had a goal disallowed in the 60th minute or something like that, and they showed the resilience to not let that setback dampen how they were playing, and they went on and just scored again. So that just showed that they had that resilience within their side, probably one of the most resilient sides in that particular league. So it definitely has that sort of impact, and it creates more situations for players to become stressed, for players to become anxious or a bit down. Or on the flip side of that, it can cause ecstasy and really high emotions, and then it's about trying to regulate those so you focus back on the task in hand. So yeah, definitely, without a doubt, will have a massive impact.
Yeah, and hopefully one day you'll be at the higher ends of the game where you can actually experience it. I think that's the aspiration for us all, really. But no, good answer there. So just sort of returning back a little bit to your coaching side as well. Now, I wanted to ask you if you had any bits of advice for a coach who's going into a new team. This is their first session or their first team meeting with their team. Would you have any advice as to what they should do in terms of planning for their team and setting up maybe a culture or anything like that?
So I think when you go into a new environment, the best piece of advice I could probably give from my limited experience would be that just to be honest. So be as honest as you can with everyone that you're going to be working with, so everyone is on the same page. And I think having an honest relationship means that if you're honest with someone, if you have to deliver bad news, like they're going to be dropped or whatever, as long as you're honest with them, then I think that will help that relationship. And I think going into a new environment, especially in a sports team, you can't pick everyone, you can't necessarily please everyone. So being honest about those sorts of things is really crucial to creating a good team environment, team atmosphere. And if you can get your players so that they feel like they can be honest with you and you're willing for them to be honest with you, even if it's negative, then that relationship then becomes a lot stronger.
Good. In terms of goal setting and sort of coming up with those team values, is it something that you would suggest a coach to involve the players in the decision-making process?
Yeah, I think without a doubt, I think actually did my dissertation for my master's on the coach-athlete relationship, and one of the things that came out of it was that there was an improvement in that relationship if players felt like they had more autonomy, so more control in what was going on within their team and with their coaches. So I think things like that, you can't set values for a team for them, if that makes sense. That needs to be a collective decision that they believe those values are important to them, because if the players involved in the club don't believe in the values that are set, then they won't adhere to them, and then that will probably lead to more conflict down the line when it comes to how do you punish someone for not adhering to team values. If they don't believe in the values in the first place and they're not their own values, then they won't. Then that will just cause more trouble. So yeah, absolutely. When doing those sorts of things, values, team goals, it's definitely important to get player input, in my opinion.
Good. And you just mentioned about that conflict. Would you have any guidance as to how to deal with a player who maybe has a bit of conflict, or there's a bit of conflict between you and a player? What would be the approach?
Again, I think it needs to be an open approach. It needs to be an honest approach, because those sorts of situations, don't get me wrong, they're difficult to handle. Nobody likes to handle them, but often if you get your guard up or if you get defensive, those sorts of things can escalate. So having an open and honest conversation would be the best place to start. Of course, everyone is different. Some people might respond better to being told instead of discussing it, but a lot of people will prefer to not be dictated to, and to have that open discussion so that you can understand where the conflict's coming from. I think understanding the origin of conflicts is crucial to diminishing them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So returning more back to yourself and your aspirations, I wanted to know if you had any role model in the field.
Role model for sports psychology, sorry.
Yeah.
If I'm perfectly honest with you, no, because it's obviously I've not been in the field for too long, and I think the nature of the job that a sports psychologist does is quite confidential. So it's not particularly, you're not front page, you're not taking press conferences after a game explaining how your technique helped this person score or anything like that. It's a lot of what is done, which suits me, is behind the scenes. So it's not there on the front and center. It almost just quietly get about your business, and then you just sit back and hopefully what you've done works. But so in that sense, role model, not as such, to be honest. You look at certain people like Gareth Southgate, for example, and I think he handles himself exceptionally, and the relationship he's managed to develop with those players over the years has been fantastic and one of the reasons for the success. So that potentially was a leading reason why I was interested in sports psychology, but specific sports psychologist role model, not too much, because it is a backseat job. If I hope that doesn't sound rude, because it's not. But yeah,
no, I can understand. Yeah, you know what? I'd love to see a psychologist come up and do an interview after a game. That'd be so funny. So for you, and again, this is probably just opinion. So I really do want to, pickle your brains a little bit. But what do you feel a good psychologist has? What's the qualities of a really good sports psychologist?
So I think that they need to be able to communicate well. I think it's quite important to be able to have those clear lines of communication with your players. I think you need to have that ability to be non-judgmental, because a lot of things that you discuss, a lot of things that you will talk about with athletes or whoever, with coaches, can be quite sensitive. They can be things that people don't necessarily want to talk about. So being able to show that there'll be no judgment there, I think, is really important. Obviously, you have to be knowledgeable, and I think that's something that I'm learning quite quickly, because my knowledge base is, I'm still trying to build that at the minute. And when you're not knowledgeable on the stuff that you're working with, I think you can be found out quite quickly, which I'm not too proud to say has happened to me over times. But then I try and combat that by being honest with people and telling them that what stage I'm at, and that I don't know everything at this stage. Well, I don't think you ever know everything, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So being able to be non-judgmental, be a good communicator, are almost fundamental skills that will get your foot in the door, and then building up that knowledge will enable you to be able to be effective at what you do.
Great. And just talking about that knowledge collection, are you doing anything at the moment, given obviously the fact that we're all indoors now? Are you doing it any terms of knowledge collection and building up a library at the moment?
Yeah, so I try and do a bit of reading most days, various books or research articles, things like that, just to keep the brain ticking over various things. Obviously, brilliant experience for me to do these virtual training sessions, because I get to prepare something each week, which means more reading, which means developing those skills and learning all that sort of stuff, which is really good. So yeah, I think lots of reading, and then once I start my stage 2, I hope that will be a real very enlightening in terms of practical work and how to improve my work in the practical field.
And that stage 2, how do you go about? Is there a certain criteria? I mean, obviously you've got to be stage 1, but is there any minimum amount of hours or a minimum amount of teams or people you've got to work with?
So there is a minimum amount of hours that you have to do. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, sorry, but
that's all right, that's not a problem.
yeah, there is minimum hours that you need to do, and you need to have got to stage 1, which was basically my master's, and then I'm currently doing a psychology conversion course with the Open University. So that is, once I've completed that, then I'll be ready to embark on my stage 2.
Great. And is that, so the Open University, that's all online, isn't it?
Yeah, that's all online. So that's
great.
Being able to, hopefully we'll be able to finish that.
Good. So I just moving slightly on. In terms of lessons that you've learned, what would you say has probably been one of the key lessons that you've sort of learned and developed from?
Throughout
your experiences. Yeah, sorry.
Great question. I think that one thing that I've learned is definitely to try and be a bit more confident in my approach. I think when I came into both the two clubs, potentially I wasn't as confident as I should have been in reaching out to the players, and that potentially is a reason why I haven't had, or the contact with players hasn't come more regularly, or didn't start coming as quickly as I maybe would have liked. So I think definitely trying to put myself in front of the players a bit more is something that I've learned. I also think that when working with individuals, I've learned that things don't need to be, there's no quick fix, if that makes sense. So things won't happen overnight, and any sort of techniques that you put in really needs to be made clear that these things need to be worked on, and it's not a sort of one attempt and then, oh, it didn't work, try something else. And really try and persevere with the sort of techniques that you're working with. Really try and use them for a good amount of time to see if they have an effect.
In terms of, if there's anyone listening in who might be an aspiring sports psychologist, do you have any sort of words of wisdom for them, or any, I guess, guidance as to where they can go?
So I think if you're looking at going into sports psychology, then certainly enrolling in a course is a really good thing to do. I think you can not necessarily, I'm not saying jump straight into a degree or anything like that, but you can do online courses which touch on particular psychological skills. So that could give a little taster of how psychology can work for athletes and coaches. So if it's something that's an interest to you, that could then, doing those sorts of courses could really tell you if it's what you think it is. So certainly something like that, and then also pick up some psychologically related books. I guess there are lots of them out there which are written really well, so that they're interesting and they cover various techniques and things like that. I'm reading one at the minute called Bounce, which is all about player progression and whether you have innate talent or whether it can be learned, which I think is a really important distinction for young players. So yeah, those sorts of things, lots of reading, just flood yourselves with information. I think, well, not flood yourselves with it, but do put yourself out there so that you can gather the information you need to know whether it's a path for you, I guess.
Good words. So I guess off the back of that, should we, as a community, should we start seeing some more sports psychologists at grassroots level? Is that a good thing?
I mean, I hope so. I think they can definitely be a benefit at grassroots level. I think it's quite clear that they are beneficial now at a high elite level, and most high elite clubs will have a sports psychologist either working with them or one that they can call in to do some work. But I hope so, because I know there were 12 or 13 other people on my Master Sports Psychology course who, some of them are going on to do sports psychology, some of them aren't, but I know that they all would have been fantastic at it and looking for opportunities. So there's definitely enough supply out there for them to recruit someone, and I think it can be really beneficial, especially to help with player progression and things like mindsets and just all those sorts of things, because your mind has a massive impact on how you behave and how you play the game, and I think understanding that and being able to control that can be really beneficial at whatever level you're working at.
So we've talked about your journey, and I guess really the last step in it is, what's your ambition? What's the overarching ambition for Ollie to go and break into an industry?
So first step, get stage 2, so get actually qualified, so I don't have to call myself a training sports psychologist anymore. I call myself a sports psychologist, or whatever the technical term is. So get that done, and then that will still be a few years. I think that process takes quite a while, so that will be good for me to be able to get the experience, develop new skills, and keep learning and reflecting on what I've been doing. So that would be good to get to that stage. And then once that stage, I guess you see what comes up. Hopefully the teams I'm working with now will make some progression, hopefully, and potentially more opportunities will come up once I get the experience and become qualified. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to put a limit on it. Of course, I'd love to work as Tottenham Hotspur's sports psychologist in the future, but that's a long way off at the minute. So for me, I'm not thinking about that too much and just trying to take the baby steps towards getting near there.
Of course. If anyone did want to be Tottenham Hotspur's sports psychologist, what would they need? What
would they need to do at Tottenham Hotspur? What would they need?
What they would need to get there, get into the position.
I think, like with any sort of job, any sort of profession, if you want to get to the top, you have to be motivated to do it. You have to want to do it. You have to love to do it. Which I think, luckily for me, is something that at this stage I am, and I hope I still am once I finish all the courses and all that sort of stuff. Obviously, like I said earlier, you need to build up that way of working with players that works. You need to create a model for yourself that you know is effective. And yeah, I think you have to be sure of yourself. You have to believe that you can do it, because I think that goes with anything, whether you're playing, coaching, sports psychology. You need to believe that you can do it. Otherwise, you'll probably get found out at some point.
And in terms of, I guess, the actual qualification side, do you need is there a step 3? Do you need a step 3, or would it be a step 2, or what are they after?
I believe that once you get your stage 2, which, as I said, is potentially a 4-year process, I think. Once you get that, I believe that you then become qualified, and that would be it for your qualifications that you would need. Of course, you can always do with anything. You can do side things which add a little string to your bow or whatever, but in terms of just sports psychology, I think once you do your stage 2, that is it, but could easily be wrong on that as well.
Great stuff. And as you know, as I've introed right at the very start, this podcast series is one that's dedicated towards coaching, and a lot of the stuff like yourself coming on will hopefully be of benefit to coaches. So I was wondering if you had any messages for any coaches listening in, maybe something regarding the importance of sports psychology and how they could bring it into their game.
Yeah, so I think, like I've said, it is important to bring it in. It sometimes isn't a priority for coaches, understandably, if they've got a lot of other things to consider. But I just think it's something that they don't need to do it the main focus of their session, but incorporate little bits of it into their session, just the way they talk. Focus on things like mindset is something that can be easily developed through the language that you use as a coach. So developing that sort of take away the fear of failure, so that when you're coaching your players, they're taking risks, they're willing to make the mistakes that will help them learn, especially at a young age. And I think psychology doesn't necessarily need to be this big hoopla, this big thing that you either do it or you don't do it. I think it can be something that you just gradually incorporate into your coaching style. And I think certain coaches will find that a lot easier. Certain coaches may find that a lot more difficult. But if you can just do it, even in really small amounts, then it can be really helpful for your team. And like I said, it doesn't need to be a big half-an-hour meeting at the end of sessions. It can be things that you probably don't even realize that you're doing, like creating constraints in your training practice is using sports psychology. That's a way of not coaching using explicit knowledge, which will help players perform under pressure and things like that. So a lot of coaches will probably use sports psychology without really realizing it. So sometimes it's just helpful to get a tap on the shoulder and make them aware of that, and then they can incorporate sports psychology more effectively into their sessions.
Brilliant. And final question, as you alluded to a little bit earlier on, you're obviously reading a book called Bounce.
Yeah.
Are there any other resources that you would sort of point for coaches to go and have a look at, or go and have a listen to improve their knowledge on this side of the game?
Yeah, so I think there's a guy called Dan Abrahams does a really good podcast called the Sports Psych Show, which is a really interesting podcast to listen to, which talks to various professionals or ex-players or researchers about psychology and how they've done it in the applied world, which would be, these are people that have been doing it for many years, so we'll have a lot more interesting things to say than I would.
No, not at all.
Also, I think anyone working with young teams or young youth squads, reading can't remember her first name, but I think Dweck's book on the growth mindset is really, really good, because I think that's a fundamental thing for younger or youth team athletes. You won't get too near the top if you don't adopt a growth mindset, I don't think. So that could be a really interesting thing. If the coaches understand what that is, then it becomes a lot easier to incorporate into sessions and to pass on to athletes.
Brilliant. Well, there you go then, guys. You've got something to listen to and something to go and have a read of. The Sports Psychology podcast is really good. I was listening, I don't know if I told you, Ollie, I was listening to one and it had the AFC Wimbledon Academy manager on there. Yeah, it was really good. It was just talking about what they do, and obviously, like as you've said, the fact that they see people, or they see players as people first and then the player second. And yeah, it's really interesting. So I vouch for you. I think recommend that. I think that'd be a really good listen. I'm interested to find out. I think I've heard of Bounce before. I'm not read it, but I'm interested to find out what your thoughts are on that afterwards. But I've heard some good things about that, so that's good. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So for now, we're going to call it full time for this podcast. There's so much more I want to ask you, but I'm going to save you that task. And I'm sure we'll probably have another episode soon where maybe we can discuss a couple of these topics in a bit more detail, maybe get a couple more coaches on as well. Maybe we could talk about some mental rehearsal or mindset stuff. I don't know if that would interest you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. So, yeah, if that interests you as well, listening in, by all means, leave a little comment, and I'm sure we can sort something out. And, yeah, if you've got any questions for Ollie, please do send them in, and I'll send them his way, and we'll see what we can do. But that was really good. Thank you very much for that, Ollie.
No, thank you, Danny. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. How can, if anyone wanted to follow you on social media, how could they follow you on social media?
Yeah, so they follow me on Twitter. I've got a specific page for my sports psychology stuff on Twitter. So it's Oliver Cottis, and the username is @CottisOliver, and Cottis is Cottis.
Is it all one word?
All one word.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, I found you now. I found you. You've been hiding from me.
Yeah, that's me.
Brilliant. And if anyone, obviously, like we have done in the past, if anyone is interested in terms of joining Ginja as a player, as a coach, you can do that by checking out the website. Just go into Google Google Ginja FC, and it'll be pretty much the first one. I'm sure of it. And just go on there and just submit an interest into joining the club, and someone will be back to you. So brilliant. Ollie, once again, thank you very much. I really do appreciate your time, and I hope you take care over this uncertain period.
Yeah, you too, Danny. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. And of course, to you, the listeners, thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, goodbye.